My name is Lily Carmichael. I'm 30 years old, married to a guy named Nate. We have two sons, ages 5 and 2. We live in Manhattan, where Nate works as a welder, and I answer phones for a rental agency. Our life together has always felt stable, comfortable, a partnership built on trust and quiet satisfaction. At least it had been until his brother blew all of that to hell. The past few weeks before this encounter had been a whirlwind of stress and emotional strain after Nate's younger brother Daniel dropped a bombshell on the family, and his infidelity shattered his marriage to my sister-in-law Claire. Claire, who'd been like a sister to me, and probably my best friend. The fallout hit everyone hard, and I'd been struggling to navigate the emotional landmines. At the time, I was 5 months pregnant with our first son. My emotions were out of control when I found out about this. Daniel had always been a gentleman, a great father, and a great friend. I was devastated, to say the least, but obviously not as devastated as Claire. They have a son, who was 7 at the time, Lucas. Claire leaned on me heavily, and Nate was caught between loyalty to his brother and anger at what he'd done, and I felt pulled in too many directions at once. And that's why the cabin trip seemed like a good idea. Trust me, just go to Disneyland. Less of a chance of running into a werewolf. Nate found a rental in the Catskills about 2 hours north of the city. The cabin was private, snuggled deep in the woods with a small lake nearby. It wasn't fancy, but the advertisement said it was rustic and charming. It even had a stone fireplace, wooden beams, and a wraparound porch. Claire came with us. So did Lucas. She needed the break as much as I did, and we wanted to get Lucas out of the city and his mind off of what was happening with his parents. The plan was simple. A weekend of fresh air, quiet nights, and no distractions. We packed board games, books, and plenty of snacks. I even brought my sketch pad, hoping to find some inspiration. When we arrived, the air was beautiful. It didn't smell like the city. It smelled like pine. The leaves were in their full, fiery glory, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and whatever wildlife was out there. Now, I admit, I have spent my entire life in the city. I had no idea what kind of wildlife would be out there, but I was excited to find out. Being out there felt like a completely different world, away from the chaos of Manhattan and the emotional mess that we'd left behind. The first day passed without any incident. Nate and Lucas fished by the lake while Claire and I sat on the porch sipping tea and talking about anything but Daniel. It felt good to see Claire relax, even if it was only for a little while. Lucas knew what had happened, although we kept the graphic details from him. He just knew his parents were going their separate ways and his life was going to be totally different. Nate felt a personal obligation to protect him and keep his mind off of his parents' impending split. Lucas had always looked up to Nate too, and it was clear to everyone that Lucas's favorite uncle was Nate. That night after dinner, Nate built a fire in the stone fireplace and we played board games until Lucas's eyes dropped. Claire carried him to bed and Nate stayed up a bit longer, but I turned in early, feeling the weight of the day and my growing baby pressing on me. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I thought it was just pregnancy insomnia, which was a usual problem lately, but as I lay there, staring at the wooden ceiling beams, I realized what had woke me up wasn't internal. It was external. There was a sound coming from outside. It was faint at first, almost mixing with the normal noises of the forest. To me, it sounded like a low, drawn-out howl, rising and falling in pitch. It wasn't like any animal sound that I'd ever heard. Not a coyote, not a wolf, and certainly not a dog. But like I said, I'm a city girl. Who was I to say it wasn't something that was supposed to be there? Still, it was kind of creepy and it made my mind wander. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, and the howl came again. But it sounded closer this time. My heart began to race, thinking of a pack of wolves surrounding the house or something. I reached over and I shook Nate's shoulder, telling him to wake up. He groaned, kind of annoyed, and asked me what was going on. I just whispered for him to listen. He rubbed his eyes, still half asleep, and then the howl came again. When he heard it, he froze, and his head cocked towards the window. He was fully awake now. I saw his face change from sleep to confusion to something closer to concern. "What the hell is that?" he asked me quietly. I shrugged and asked how I was supposed to know. He moved to get out of bed and grabbed his phone from the nightstand, saying he was going to go check it out, but I grabbed his arm and told him not to go outside. He promised me he was just going to look from the porch, and even though the thought of going outside still frightened me, I agreed to it. I guess curiosity was getting the better of me too. I remember when we stepped outside, it was a lot colder. It was warm during the day, but once the sun went down, it was a completely different situation. Even with our jackets on, I was shivering, but I guess that could have been from the anticipation of what we might see out there. He didn't want me to go at first, but I told him if he was going outside, I was going with him. Nate went onto the porch first, and I followed him. I stayed closer to the door, though. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet now, like it was holding its breath the same way that I was. I asked Nate if he saw anything, but it came out as this pathetic little whisper. He didn't answer me right away, but I could see he was staring out at the tree line like he was either looking for something or watching something. I wanted to ask again, but I decided to let him do his thing, so I kept quiet. Then he slowly raised a hand up and pointed towards the trees over to the left and whispered, "There." I followed his gaze and saw it, or at least I thought I did. It was like a shadowy form, low to the ground, moving between the trees. It was too far and too dark to make out any details, but it didn't move like a deer or a bear. Its movements were almost erratic. Something was off about it. I guess that could be a good description. I don't really know. I just know that when I was standing there, I didn't think that it was anything that I could identify. I asked what it was, but Nate didn't know either. He just said it was big. The shadow disappeared into the woods, and for a moment we both stood there, trying to see where it had gone. Even though it was so damn dark out there, we tried our best, but obviously we couldn't see anything. When we didn't see it anymore, whatever it was had moved on, or so we thought. We went back to our room, and fell asleep without much thought about it, just guessing it was some kind of nocturnal animal that we weren't familiar with. But the next morning, Nate and I decided not to mention the noise to Claire or Lucas. There was no point in scaring them, especially since we didn't know what we'd heard or what we had seen. We came out here to have a good time with little Lucas, and it felt wrong when I thought about how that story might scare him. The poor kid was dealing with enough, and I wanted this trip to be something good that he remembered through all the bad crap. I couldn't shake the feeling of uneasiness, though. Call it hormones or whatever you want, but I think it was my body telling me that danger was present, and that I needed to get out of there to protect the baby. It was like, even in the daylight, the woods felt different. The happy rustling leaves now felt threatening, and the shadows between the trees felt like it was hiding something that was waiting to jump out and scare you. After breakfast, though, Nate suggested a short hike. Lucas was eager to explore, and Claire seemed relieved at the distraction. I agreed, though I couldn't shake that lingering tension in my chest. We chose a trail that looped around the lake, suggesting an easy terrain for my body and plenty of photo opportunities for Lucas. For the first half of the hike, everything seemed normal. Lucas ran ahead, collecting leaves and pointing out chipmunks and stuff, while Nate and Claire chatted about work. But halfway through, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of the trail, almost hidden under a layer of leaves, were tracks. At first, I thought they were from a large dog, but it would have to be bigger than any breed that I'd seen. But I guess it wasn't impossible. Then I noticed something strange about the tracks. The tracks weren't just paw prints. They looked stretched out, with what looked like claw marks at the end. I called Nate to come over. He did, and so did Lucas and Claire. I pointed out the tracks, and I could see his brow sag. Obviously, he was thinking about the same thing I was. Our late-night visitor last night. Even Claire looked weirded out and said those were too big to be from a dog. Nate also pointed something else out. The stride. The prints were so far apart, it didn't look possible. We stood there for a brief moment, discussing what it could be. Everything from a wolf to a bear, but none of those things made me feel any better about being out there without protection. Finally, Nate suggested that we just get moving, a plan I was definitely happy to agree with. I glanced around nervously, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from the night before, but the woods were still, except for the wind. We kept walking on the trail, but I couldn't get those tracks out of my mind. There was something about them, something that didn't sit right in my stomach. They were too large, too far apart, and too different from any animal prints that I knew about. The claw marks in the dirt and the unnatural way they seemed to press into the ground made me uneasy. And even though I didn't know what type of animals could be out there, I was starting to be certain that whatever we were seeing wasn't actually supposed to be out there. Nate didn't say anything about the tracks, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he was just as anxious as I was. And Claire seemed distracted too, holding Lucas's hand a little too tightly when he tried to skip ahead. We were all pretending to be fine, but something was off. I could feel it, and I was getting the growing sense that both of them could too. As we rounded a corner of the trail, the sound of rushing water from the creek helped ease some of that anxiety, but it didn't fully go away. It was more of a temporary distraction. The woods around us were quiet too. There were no birds singing, no animals foraging, nothing. We reached the far side of the lake where the trail curved through the denser trees. The water was still, and you could see the trees and the clouds reflecting on it. But I saw something else too. It looked like a dark shape, far across the lake on the edge of the woods. I wasn't sure at first what I was seeing, but my heart began to race as I realized it wasn't a shadow of a tree or a log, because whatever it was moving. Something was standing in the forest at the far end of the lake, and it felt like it was watching us. The figure was tall enough to be seen above the tree line, and its shape was abnormally big. I froze, and my words caught in my throat. Claire picked up on my reaction and asked what was wrong. Then she looked in the same direction that I was staring. I told her I didn't know, but something was over on the other side of the lake and was watching us. Nate looked over there too, but tried to rationalize it, telling us that someone else was probably over there hiking. But I wasn't so sure. The figure wasn't moving in a way that made sense for a person. It was still too wrong. And then it moved. The motion was so abrupt that I actually gasped. "I don't think that's a person," I said, surprised at how my voice was trembling. I remember Nate stepping in front of us, telling the three of us to stay behind him. I remember Claire suggesting we should go back, and I remember Lucas telling his mom that he was scared. We decided that Claire's idea was best. We should just head back to the cabin. We started to walk back, quicker than we moved while we were hiking into the lake. The tension in the air was unmistakable. All of us were scared now. Every step felt heavier than the last. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but whatever it was gone. For a few moments, I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light, or shadows. Maybe my mind had been playing tricks on me because I was so scared from the night before and all the other things that we'd experienced on the hike in. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. We reached the edge of the trail from where the trees opened to the cabin, and I heard that same howl again. It echoed across the forest. It sounded long and drawn out and sent chills down my spine. Again, it didn't sound like any animal that I'd ever heard before. It was too deep and too human. Another howl echoed after that, but this one wasn't from the same direction. It was from the opposite side of us. I felt my entire body shudder when I heard the second howl. It was a fear that I have never felt before or since. It was almost paralyzing, and I could actually feel my knees buckle. Now we knew there was more than one of whatever the hell was out there. And it felt like they were circling us. I was terrified for my life, the lives of the people I was with, and the life of the baby inside of me. "Run," Nate whispered, and I could see the pale look on his face. He was really scared too. Without another word, he grabbed my hand and we all took off down the trail. Lucas was clinging to Claire's arm, and he was crying, sensing the danger that all of us were feeling. Nate had my hand. I had one of Lucas's hands, and Claire had the other. I felt like I was in a scary movie. The fear I felt right there was thick and surreal, and it made it hard to even think. All I knew was we had to get to the cabin. And then the sound of heavy footsteps started behind us. And whatever it was moving fast. Whatever was out there, whatever had been watching us across the lake, was following us now. I just knew it. We pushed ourselves harder, not knowing what we were running from, but none of us wanted to find out either. So we just ran. We neared the clearing where the cabin came into view, and I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was there again, but this time it was moving swiftly through the trees, too quickly to be a person, too smooth to be anything natural. And then I realized something. It wasn't following us. It was hunting us. We were so close to the cabin, it was like paradise. We could get inside, lock the doors, and finally be safe. But those footsteps were getting louder, and I could hear grunting behind us. It sounded like it was right there behind us, and I didn't dare look back again. My only focus was the cabin, the door, the safety of the walls. At some point, Nate actually scooped Lucas up and was running with him in his arms as me and Claire ran together. I remember her making this noise that I wouldn't exactly call a scream. It was more like a frightened wail. It was because she'd looked back and saw what was behind us. I wasn't making that mistake. When we finally reached the cabin, Nate basically crashed through the door, set Lucas down and pulled the two of us inside before slamming the door and locking it. And then he pressed his back against the door like he was trying to protect us from some kind of intruder that was going to come crashing through. I looked at my hands because they were actually shaking so bad. Nate ran to the windows, pulling the curtains closed, then checking all the other doors to make sure that they were secure too. Claire had Lucas huddled in her arms, whispering reassurances to him, though I could see the fear in her eyes too. She saw what it was, and it shook her to her core. We were all in the living room, listening for that thing, hoping it was gone. I asked what it was, but Nate didn't know. Claire said it was on two legs when it was chasing us, but wouldn't describe it any further in front of Lucas. I didn't think I wanted to hear about what she saw anyways. Nate said it wasn't an animal that he'd ever seen, and I realized that he saw it too. Probably when he was slamming the door shut. He said we needed to stay inside. Yeah, like I was going out there anytime soon. He said we needed to wait until morning. I was good with that. We did what we could to reinforce the cabin. Nate moved some furniture in front of the windows, and we lit a fire in the fireplace. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. We stayed huddled together in the living room, the fire burning low, the wind shaking the windows. I could still hear the occasional howl cutting through the air, too. It was the craziest thing that I'd ever experienced. It was impossible to sleep, but I felt exhaustion pressing on my eyelids. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified. Every sound outside made my heart race. Lucas was the only one to sleep that night. His head was in Claire's lap as she sat on the couch with me. When I was sure that Lucas was asleep, I asked them what they had seen. Claire said it looked like a wolf, but it was running on two legs when it was chasing us. Nate agreed. That's what he saw too. They agreed on almost every detail that they could think of. And what they saw was this. It was taller than a man, probably 7 foot something. It had the head and muzzle of a wolf, but stood like a man and was covered in brown fur, and had front limbs that ended in more of a hand than a paw. And when it was running, it moved its arms back and forth like a sprinter. I asked if they were describing a werewolf, but neither of them said anything else. None of us even spoke much after that. We were all just thinking about how impossible this situation was. Yet, here we were, in the middle of a bad monster flick. The hours seemed to stretch for an eternity. I don't even know how we managed to survive the rest of the night, but as dawn finally broke, the howling stopped. The woods were eerily still, but the sounds of nature were slowly returning, which Nate pointed out was a good thing. We cautiously peeked through the blinds. There was nothing to see, just the peaceful morning light shining through the trees. The figure, whatever the hell it was gone, and the howling had stopped, so we chanced going to the car. We got in and got the hell out of there. But I knew what we had seen, and I knew it wasn't over. That creature, whatever it was, would be back, and I would never forget the way that it moved, or the sounds that it made, or the way that it made me feel like prey. My name is Sarah Matheson, and I'm 42 years old. I'm a rancher from the heart of Iowa. For as long as I can remember, I have lived a life dictated by our land, our animals, and the seasons. My husband Tom and I own a 200-acre ranch just outside of a small town called Willow Creek. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, gossip spreads quickly, and life revolves around church socials and high school football games. We raise cattle, we have horses, we grow some corn, and we keep chickens for fresh eggs. It's a modest life, but it's honest, and it's the only life that I've ever wanted. We have 2 boys, Luke, who's 16, and Tyler, who's 12. They're ranch kids through and through, both of them handy with a lasso, and more comfortable in boots than sneakers. When they're not helping us on the ranch, they're riding their dirt bikes or fishing. We also have a motley crew of animals. Our border collie Jack, a barn cat named Whiskers, and a retired ranch horse named Daisy. She used to be a racer, but now she spends her days grazing in the pasture. Life on the ranch is as predictable as the sunrise. That is until one day where it's not predictable at all. What happened last September turned our predictable world upside down and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the land that I've called home almost my entire life. It was mid-September. It was evening, and the sun was low, and it was lighting up our fields in this wonderful glow. The boys were at their friend's house for the night, and Tom had gone into town for supplies. I had the ranch to myself, which was a rare and treasured thing, and I wanted to just take in the beauty of this land that we owned. After finishing my chores, I decided to take Jack and head out to the west pasture to check on the fencing. We'd had some trouble out there with deer knocking over the section of it, and I wanted to make sure everything was secure before the cattle were moved in over the coming weeks. Jack trotted ahead of me as usual, and we followed the path through the tall grass. We'd walked it so many times, we actually wore a trail into that grass. The crickets had already begun to chirp, and I was enjoying the little breeze that was blowing across my face. It brought a smell of hay to me, something that I loved. It was peaceful, and I was just thinking about how grateful I was for the life that we built. As we neared the edge of the pasture, something caught my attention though. A new smell. It was faint, but distinct. It was sharp and musky, like wet dog mixed with something metallic. Now Jack is normally confident and eager, but at the same time, right when I smelled that smell, he froze in his tracks, and his ears perked up, and he tucked his tail. He let out a low growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I asked him what was wrong, noting his reaction, and my own feeling of uneasiness that was slowly spreading through my body. Something just felt wrong. Now, I've been in this town, and at this ranch, almost my entire life. I have seen every animal that's wandered through. I'm not afraid of these creatures, but at that moment, I couldn't explain why I was so anxious. Of course, being a dog, Jack didn't answer, but his stance told me all I needed to know. Something was out there, and it was something that didn't belong there. The sun had almost disappeared below the horizon by the time I spotted it. At first, I just thought it was a deer, standing just beyond the tree line, at the far end of the pasture, but as I squinted into the fading light, I realized this thing whatever it was standing upright. It was too tall and broad to be a deer, or anything else I could identify for that matter. My heart began to pound as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a figure, easily 6.5 feet tall, covered in shaggy black fur. Its ears were pointed, almost wolf-like, and it had a long tail, and long arms too, but when I saw the face, that's what stopped me cold. It looked like a dog's face, or a wolf, but this face was elongated, and this thing was snarling. It had these yellow eyes that glowed faintly, even in the dim light. But I knew it wasn't a dog, and it wasn't a wolf. No dog I'd ever seen could stand on 2 legs like that, with shoulders as broad as a linebacker's, and arms that hung unnaturally long. And man, did it smell. Working on a ranch and living the lifestyle that we do, you get accustomed to smelly things. We clean stalls every day, and bad smells don't bother me, but this thing stank. The musk coming from it was thick and disgusting. It smelled so bad I could feel the bile start to rise in the back of my throat, and it was all I could do to stop from gagging. I wanted to believe that my eyes were playing tricks on me, that it was just a shadow or a trick of light, but then it moved. It actually took a step towards me, and I could hear the sound of its claws scraping against the rocky ground. And that was enough to snap me out of my daze. Jack was growling, looking like he wanted to run for this thing, but I yelled at him, "Jack, heel!" My voice was dry with fear, though. To my relief, Jack obeyed. He retreated to my side, but continued to growl low in his throat. That kind of growl that says, "I'm defending my family." I think, at the sound of the growling, this creature stopped and snarled, but it could have just been doing that to play with me or try to intimidate me. It started baring these horrible teeth and tilting its head like it was showing those teeth off. And that's when I felt like it was really taunting me. Like it was showing me these deadly teeth that it had, telling me that it could rip me apart as easy as it wanted to. My blood was ice. What in the world was I looking at? For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. I didn't dare breathe. I didn't even dare blink. What I was looking at looked just like the werewolves that you see in the movies that they have in Hollywood. And then, with a suddenness that made me jump, it let out this deep, deep growl. The growl seemed to rumble in the air, like even the trees could feel it. Jack whimpered at the sound. Not so brave anymore. And it made my bones shake, I swear to you. I could feel the reverb in my body. I should have run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn and flee, but my feet were rooted to the ground. All I could do was clutch that stupid flashlight in my hand like it was some kind of talisman. Though I doubted it would do much good against whatever this thing really was. Because my mind was telling me, even though it looked like a werewolf, that it couldn't be a werewolf because those things don't exist, right? I'm telling you, when it growled again, that growl cut through the stillness like a blade. And then Jack, to my horror, found his courage again and lunged forward, barking furiously at this thing. I shouted no to him and tried to get him to heel, but the damn dog ignored me. His instinct was to protect me, no matter what threat he was facing. That creature, or whatever you want to call it, it didn't flinch though. It actually crouched low. I could see its muscles rippling beneath the fur. And I thought to myself that it was getting ready to pounce. It was getting ready for Jack's attack, and it was going to kill him with ease. My stomach dropped because I knew Jack was no match for this thing. I fumbled for the flashlight switch and I clicked it on, aiming the beam directly at this thing's face. And luckily that bright light seemed to startle it, and for a second it reared back, shielding its eyes with this massively large clawed hand. The way it moved was so human that just thinking about it still frightens me. As I'm typing this, I'm actually getting goosebumps just remembering it. I don't know anything in this world that can do that. Jack sure as hell can't shield his eyes. And no dog or wolf I know has paws that actually look more like hands. I yelled at Jack to come again. This time I tried to sound mad. I tried to use every ounce of authority that I could muster. The dog hesitated, but then turned and sprinted back to me, tail tucked low. Then that monster lowered its hand and snarled again. Its lips pulled back to show those long, glistening fangs again. I could actually feel the weight of its eyes pressing down on me. And I realized that this thing wasn't an animal acting out of fear or hunger. It was intelligent. More intelligent than any other animal that I know. This thing was assessing me, like a person would before he picked a fight. And that was another indication to me that this thing had a human quality intelligence to it. I stepped backwards, keeping the flashlight trained on it, my mind racing, thinking about how it didn't seem to like the flashlight. Maybe the light hurt its eyes. Maybe it was sensitive to light. Maybe it was nocturnal. 1,000 things were racing through my mind at that point. Should I run? Should I stay there? Would it chase me? Was it better to stand my ground? Would they even find my body if this thing attacked me? But before I could decide, that thing made the choice for me. Fast as hell, this thing leapt over the fence like it was nothing and landed on the other side. It dropped from 2 legs to 4 and it loped into the woods with the same gait that you see a hyena do on TV. Its movements were fluid. It was as quiet as a jungle cat despite its size. Within seconds, it vanished into the shadows, and that acrid smell of musk was the only thing left behind. I stood there for a long time, the flashlight shaking in my hand, my breath coming in short gasps. By the time I made it back to the house, my legs really felt like they were jello. Jack stuck close to me. His usual energy changed to this nervous agitation. I locked the doors and the windows, which was something I hadn't felt the need to do in years, and I sat at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? No. The image of those glowing yellow eyes and the sound of its growl were seared into my memory, and they still are. As real as the chair I'm sitting in right now, that thing was real. But what was it? A bear? Some kind of escaped exotic animal? Something else? Was it really a werewolf? When Tom got home later that night, I told him everything. To his credit, he didn't laugh or dismiss me, but I could see the suspicion in his eyes. Did he think I was just hacking on him? We do like to play practical jokes on each other, but I swore to him that everything I told him was true. Maybe it was just a big coyote or wolf was the only thing he could offer while he tried to reassure me. But I snapped at him. Standing on 2 legs with man arms? Seriously, Tom? I felt bad as soon as the words came out of my mouth. We never argue, and he was just trying to help. I was just frustrated. He held his hands up like he was innocent and said he wasn't saying that I was lying. He was just trying to help me figure out what the hell it was that I saw. He said, regardless of what it was, we need to be alert, and we needed to tell the boys when they came back the next day. He even put up cameras for me, just to make me feel better. The cameras didn't capture anything though, and for the next week, I was jumpy. I avoided the west pasture and kept the boys close whenever they were outside. And Jack, he seemed different too, more skittish and more alert. But as the days passed and the creature didn't come back, I actually began to relax. It was late October, about 6 weeks after the first encounter when it happened again. This time it wasn't just me that saw it though. Tom and I were sitting on the porch one evening, enjoying that crisp fall air, right before it turns chilly. And we heard the cattle in the east pasture start to bawl. They sounded scared. It wasn't your usual lowing. My mind immediately went to that thing. Tom grabbed a rifle, and we headed out with Jack leading the way, his nose to the ground. When we reached the pasture, the scene was chaos. The cattle were clustered together, their eyes wild, and their movements were just frantic. One of them, our young heifer, was lying on its side near the fence, and her flank was torn open like something big had attacked her. And there, just beyond the tree line, was that damn wolf creature again. It stood there, half in the shadows, but its size and stance were unmistakable to me. I knew exactly what I was looking at this time. Tom saw it too, and I heard him gasp. He raised the rifle, but before he could fire, it turned and disappeared into the woods. This thing moved so incredibly fast. We spent the rest of the night rounding up the cattle and calling the sheriff. Of course, by the time anyone arrived, there was no trace of that thing, just the mauled heifer and some deep claw-like marks in the dirt. The sheriff just chalked it up to a bear attack, but I knew better, and now Tom knew better too, even if he wouldn't say it out loud. Honestly, even as terrifying as that second encounter was as well, it was comforting knowing that Tom saw it too and that I wasn't alone in this anymore. We didn't see the creature again after that night, but its presence still haunted us like a shadow hanging over the ranch. I started carrying a pistol whenever I went out, and we kept the boys close by, forbidding them from riding out into the pastures alone. We told them what happened, what we think was really out there, and that they shouldn't go around talking about it unless someone else says that they saw it too. Let me tell you, the worst part wasn't the fear. It's the not knowing. What was it? Why had it come to our ranch, and was it going to come back? Even now, I find myself watching the tree line whenever I'm outside, half expecting to see its glowing yellow eyes staring at me. Some nights, when the wind is just right, I catch that same musky smell and I can feel my heart start to race. I don't know if it's still out there, but I do know one thing. The land that I've called home my entire life doesn't feel quite so familiar anymore. My name is Grayson. I'm married, we have 2 kids, and I spend most of my life in Winchester, Kentucky. I work as a structural engineer, and when I'm not working, you can find me hiking, fishing, or working in the garden in my backyard. My younger brother Ethan is 28 years old. He's a single high school science teacher, and probably the most adventurous guy that I know. He's the kind of person who dives headfirst into every hobby that he picks up. Over the years, he's become a kayaker, an amateur cartoonist, and a self-taught wildlife tracker. We've always been very close. Growing up, our dad would take us camping and hunting in the Daniel Boone National Forest, which is like 700,000 acres of wilderness in eastern Kentucky. Those trips were where Ethan and I learned everything we know about the outdoors. Our dad was a wildlife official. He worked for the state, and it was his job to take care of the forest. Our most recent trip started like every other one, a weekend escape to the woods for some hiking, fishing, and camping. But what we saw out there, just as the sun came up on that second morning, it changed everything. We got there late Friday afternoon and parked at a trailhead that led to one of our favorite spots. This spot was a secluded valley with a small creek that cut through it. The hike in took about 2 hours usually, but the hike was one of the best parts of every trip. This was late autumn of 2022, so the air was cool and the forest smelled like damp earth and wet leaves. It felt like home. We usually take our time hiking in, seeing the sights and appreciating the wilderness. By the time we set up camp, the sun was dipping low at the ridgeline, casting long shadows through the trees. I savored these times. Out there in the forest, this was always my favorite place to be. For now. We spend the evening cooking. We usually do it over a campfire and just bullshit like brothers do. Ethan joked about finally trying online dating, and I teased him about not being able to just go out and find a girlfriend. By about 10 p.m. though, we were both ready to crash. We had an early morning hike to rest up for the next day. Looking back on it now, I remember the night was unusually quiet. No owls, no rustling of the underbrush, just an eerie quiet that neither of us commented on at the time. The next morning, we both woke up early, like we always do out there. We made some breakfast, eggs and bacon over the fire with some fresh coffee. The plan was to hike up to the ridge that we were familiar with to watch the sunrise before going down to the creek to fish for dinner that night. Ethan and I had done this routine dozens of times before. It was one of those traditions we always did while we were out in the woods together. The hike up to the ridge was uneventful at first. Same old ridge, same old trees, same old sights. We didn't see a single soul out there, which wasn't unusual. We never really ran into anyone else while we were there. That was one of the main reasons we enjoyed these activities so much. People were scarce there. But the forest, it felt empty, yet alive, in that way only wilderness can. You know, lots of living things around you that stay out of sight most of the time, but you know they're there. As we climbed higher, though, things started to just feel off. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It just wasn't quiet. It was dead silent. No birds, no wind in the trees. Not even the sound of water trickling in the creek nearby. Just the crunch of our own boots on that leaf-strewn trail. This is a forest that is active 100% of the time that we're there. There's always some type of animal chattering or making noise. This time, though, everything was just completely quiet. I remember Ethan asking me, "Do you hear that?" after a few moments of noticing the silence. "Hear what?" I asked, thinking that he had actually heard something. "Exactly," he said, which made me realize that he seemed pretty creeped out by the dead silence of the forest. That silence only means one thing. Something big and predatory is nearby. So we just stood there for a moment, listening to the nothingness. Then Ethan pointed to something just off the trail. A set of what looked like deep gouges carved into the trunk of a tree. I guessed a bear, but Ethan shook his head. "Those aren't claw marks, and they're way too high up," is what he told me. I walked over to the tree to get a better look, and he was right. The gouges were like 9 feet off the ground, and spaced too far apart to be made by anything that we could name. And they were jagged, like whatever had made them was testing its strength against the tree or something. We shrugged it off, stupidly, and kept moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, it felt like I'd catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, like a shadow moving through the trees, but careful to stay out of sight. The thing was, though, it was too big to be a deer, and each time I turned to look, there was nothing there. We reached that ridge just before sunrise. The view was beautiful, just like always. The sky was a mix of soft pinks and oranges, and for a while, we forgot about the strange silence and the marks up on the tree. It looked like a painting up in the sky. Just beautiful. It took me back to all the times our dad had brought us out there while he was alive. We found a flat rock to sit on and took in the view. For a few minutes, we just sat there in silence and then started talking about Dad. But as the conversation quieted down as we reflected on our departed father, we heard it again. That silence. And then something started to growl. Whatever it was started off as a low growl, so faint I wasn't even sure that I had heard it or imagined it, but Ethan heard it too, because he turned to me and his face was pale. "You heard that, right?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the growl came again. This time it was louder, and it was close. Too close for my liking. We both stood up, scanning the trees behind us. The forest was still full of shadows at this point, but something was moving through them. This hulking, dark shape that moved with an unnatural grace. "Bear?" I whispered, but my voice was barely audible. I remember Ethan shaking his head and saying, "No way. Too big." And then this thing stepped into view, and my breath caught in my throat. It stood on two legs, easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in matted, dark fur. Its arms were long, ending in hands that looked almost human, but tipped with these claws as long as my fingers. One swipe could eviscerate anything that it was coming up against. Its head froze me in place. It was like a wolf, but way too big, and of course this thing was standing on 2 legs. It had this look of just pure intelligence and self-awareness that was unmistakably evident. I swear to you, it felt like this thing was self-aware. It had to be. And its eyes were that yellow that you always hear about. And they seemed to give off this glow. And then those glowing yellow eyes locked on to our eyes. And in that moment, I knew we were looking at something that shouldn't exist. But exist it did nonetheless, because it was standing there right in front of us. It felt like 100 hours, where none of us moved. I'm sure it was just a few seconds, though. And this creature looked like it was studying us the whole time. Its ears were twitching. I felt like it was trying to decide what to do next. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and it let out some sound that was like a cross between a growl and a snarl. I could feel that vibration in my fillings. I stood there, not sure of what to do, knowing that I shouldn't run, and fighting every instinct to just run back into the forest and get away from this thing as fast as possible. "Go," Ethan said. He was low and serious in his tone. "We need to go." At the same time, we turned and took off down the trail, running faster than I ever thought possible. The sound of that thing following us, crashing through the underbrush, was the only thing my mind could focus on. Whatever it was giving chase, and I knew it wasn't going to be long before it caught us. "Don't look back," Ethan yelled, but of course, I did. That creature was gaining on us, running on 2 legs like a werewolf from a horror movie. For as massive as it was so graceful. It didn't run like a bear or a wolf. It ran like something that knew it was the apex predator and it didn't need to hurry to catch its prey. We reached this incline that was pretty steep, and we tried to hurry down, but basically we half slid, half fell to the ground below the incline. At the bottom was an area that made a small cover of rocks that basically looked like a tiny little cave. It had a shallow opening where the rocks were, and barely big enough for both of us to squeeze into it, but there wasn't anything else for us to do. We both had the same idea at once. We needed to go in there. It might not be able to get to us. We pressed ourselves against the back wall as far away from the entrance as possible. I remember sweat just pouring off of me and panting so hard I thought I was going to pass out. Ethan was fumbling with the gun he had on his side, but his hands were shaking so much I don't think he could have pulled the trigger if he wanted to. That thing stopped at the entrance. It knew we were in there. This huge werewolf just blocking out the sun and eyeing us. The way the eyes moved back and forth is something I will never forget. It was damn smart. Maybe as smart as us. It crouched low, peering into the cave with those glowing eyes, and for a moment, I thought it was going to come in after us. All I could think about was never seeing my family again. "Shoot!" I yelled at my brother. As I did, I watched this thing look at the gun in Ethan's hands and give this frustrated huff. It knew what a gun was. That's how smart these creatures are. It recognized a gun. Not only that, it reacted with a human emotion to seeing that gun. Instead of attacking us, it let out a low, guttural growl and it stood up. Its ears were swiveling like it was listening for something. It looked back at us, actually bared its teeth like it was pissed off or frustrated, and it took off out of sight. It ran into the forest. Its footsteps were getting quieter as it moved away from us. But We sure as hell weren't going anywhere yet. We stayed in that cave for what felt like hours, too afraid to even move. When we finally had the stones to come out, the forest felt different. It was like it was less oppressive, but it was still eerily quiet. Needless to say, that concluded our camping trip. We didn't speak much on the hike back to the car, and Ethan held his gun in his hand the entire time. Both of us kept glancing over our shoulders, half expecting that creature to appear again, and both of us were just concentrating on getting back to the safety of our car. If there was something to talk about, or if we needed to give a warning, I was confident we would do that, but for the most part, I think we were both just lost in our own thoughts and determined to get out of there alive. When we finally reached the trailhead, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, and I actually started to cry. Even the car ride back was quiet for a long time, until Ethan asked if I was going to tell anyone about it. I asked who would believe us, that we saw a real-life werewolf. He said it wasn't a werewolf, and even saying it out loud, werewolf, just felt ridiculous. But I feel as much as both of us wanted to continue denying something like that, what we saw that day, it wouldn't let us deny it anymore. What we saw was real. He told me maybe we should just leave it alone, but something told me that he wasn't actually willing to do that. I knew my brother fairly well, and I knew that he was going to jump feet first into this one just like he jumps into everything. Neither of us had ever been into conspiracy theories or even believers in the paranormal. We were both raised rational men who dealt in facts and science, but facts didn't explain what we saw, and I knew my brother needed more answers. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the little details that we'd brushed off. The claw marks on the tree, the silence of the forest, the glimpses of movement in the shadows. It was like the forest had been trying to warn us, but we ignored every single sign. I wondered what my dad would think of us. How foolish we were for ignoring all of these warning signs and continuing to just go further and further away from safety. Ethan didn't mention that thing for about a month. Then he called me, and the first thing he said was, "It's called an upright canine gray." I knew he'd gone down the rabbit hole. He told me about Linda Godfrey and her work on these things, aka a dogman. He told me there'd been sightings in Michigan, Wisconsin, even Kentucky. He even found a report from a guy who saw something similar in the Red River Gorge back in the 90s. And he described the same thing. 7 feet tall, wolf-like, glowing eyes. He said it chased him too. I guess hearing someone else's story, even secondhand, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. If others had seen it, maybe we weren't crazy after all. But that encounter started to become a wedge between us. Ethan wanted answers. He spent his evenings researching and reading eyewitness accounts and even reaching out to people who claimed to have seen them too. I, on the other hand, wanted to forget about it. I wanted nothing to do with the creature that we saw out there. I threw myself into work, avoided conversations about the forest, and pretended life was normal. But it wasn't. I started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. I'd dream of those glowing eyes staring at me, the growl echoing in my ears. My wife would ask me what was wrong, but all I could tell her is that I had a bad dream. She'd cuddle me and tell me everything was alright, but in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about that thing. Even simple things started to become difficult. The woods behind my house, which I'd always found peaceful, now felt ominous. I stopped taking the kids on nature walks, afraid of what might be out there. And they'd question me about it. "Daddy, why can't we go explore?" I'd always have an excuse for them. Then my crazy-ass brother told me he was going back out there to investigate. I told him I would not be joining him and that he was crazy for doing it himself. I begged him not to do something so stupid after seeing something like what we did. We argued about it for days until he told me he wasn't changing his mind. and I knew that he wouldn't change his mind. I knew he needed to go back out there, because I knew he needed to know what was going on. He promised me to stay safe. He'd take a firearm and stick to the outskirts, but I was terrified that he wasn't going to come back. My brother is my best friend. I didn't want him to die. That thing out there was dangerous. But he went anyways. Although he came back the very next day after he went out there. He told me while he didn't see anything, he could feel something watching him. At night it was worse, especially when things got quiet again. He stayed next to his fire for hours, gripping his gun and listening for anything that was off. He told me he'd never been that scared, with the exception of when we actually saw that thing. His obsession disappeared after that, and man, I was happy about that. He stopped talking about the Dogman, stopped researching, and even stopped going into the forest altogether. I think it really spooked him, knowing that he had foolishly went out there again, and that thing was closer than he could imagine, even if he couldn't see it. I think he felt its presence. Every so often, I'd think I saw something moving in the woods near my house. A shadow too large and too quick to be a deer. At night, I'd lie awake, listening for the growl, and I prayed I would never hear it again. The worst part, though, was the fear for my family. I started locking the doors and windows religiously. I bought a rifle and taught my wife how to use it, though I couldn't bring myself to tell her why. It wasn't until about 6 months later that we decided to share our story. We agreed to do it anonymously, posting the account on a website dedicated to cryptid encounters. We didn't expect much, but the response was overwhelming. Other people reached out, sharing similar stories. Some were even from the Daniel Boone National Forest, and others were from different parts of the country. There were even a few from Europe. It was both comforting and terrifying, knowing that we weren't alone in this. One message, though, stood out. It was from a retired forest ranger who claimed to have seen something similar in the 1980s. He warned us to stay away from the area where we had our encounter. Some things aren't meant to be understood, he wrote, and some places aren't meant for people. After all the time that's passed between now and when we had our encounter, I think we can finally openly talk about it. And we can do it without fear of being judged. We know who we can talk to and when to keep our mouths shut. My wife believed me when I finally told her, and I admitted why I'd been acting so weird. All I got from her was support. Neither of us have been back to the Daniel Boone National Forest since then. We've talked about what happened that morning, trying to make sense of it, but there's just no answers other than things that aren't supposed to be here. Things that are supposed to be fiction. Whatever we saw, it wasn't a bear or a wolf or any other animal that belongs in those woods. Dogman, werewolf, wolfman, upright canine, whatever. That's what we saw that day. When we tell the story, people always ask if I'm sure about what I saw, or if maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my imagination, or if we were on drugs that day. All I can say is this. I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the way it looked at us. Like it knew that we didn't belong there and it wanted us out. Well, message heard, Wolfman. I'll never go into your forest again. My name is Amanda Johnson. I'm 35 years old, and I've lived in rural Tennessee my entire life. I grew up in a little town called Kingston, tucked in the Appalachian foothills. I was raised on a small farm with my parents and my two brothers. We didn't have much, but we made do. I always felt a strong connection to nature. My father taught me to hunt, fish, and respect the land. I'm an outdoorsy person through and through, and I've always been more comfortable in the woods than in a crowd. I'm now married to a man named Matt, and we've got two little girls, both under the age of 10. Matt works in town as a contractor, and I stay at home with the kids, though I often find myself working part-time at the local hardware store. Life is good, but like anyone, we face our struggles. The mortgage is high, bills pile up, and there's never enough time for everything. I've learned to deal with it, though, just like everyone else around here does. But none of that is the reason I'm telling you this story. The reason I'm telling you this story is because of what happened one chilly fall evening a couple of years ago. I'll never forget it, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that it was something else, I can't deny what I saw. Something in those woods, just outside of Kingston, looked back at me that night, and it wasn't human. It was Thursday, the 13th of October. The weather had been cooler than usual that week, with the evenings dipping into the low 40s. I'd just finished up with some laundry. The house was quiet, with the girls playing in the rooms. Matt was still at work, and my mom was there, reading quietly in the den. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I was feeling a little stir-crazy, and I just needed a moment of solitude. I've always loved the woods around our property. There's a small trail that leads down through the trees, winding through a grove of tall oaks and pines. It's a peaceful place to think, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot always puts me at ease. My plan was to walk a few miles to a spot where a creek runs through the woods, where I could sit on the rocks and let my mind wander. I threw on a flannel shirt, some old jeans, and my hiking boots. The sun had just started setting, casting long shadows along the land, and the air had that autumn bite to it that always made me feel alive. I didn't expect to be out long, an hour, maybe two at most. I told my mom I was going for a walk, and she said she'd stay with the kids since they were upstairs having fun. The woods behind our house were dense, and the trail is narrow. It wasn't long before I was deep in the forest, with the sounds of the world around me muffled by the thick canopy of trees. The birds had already started to quiet for the evening. As I walked, I felt that familiar comfort of being surrounded by nature, but there was also something strange that night. A nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, you could say. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a sense of unease. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just the darkening sky and the quiet of the evening getting to me, but the further I walked, the stronger the feeling became. It wasn't just the unusual stillness of the forest. It felt like something was watching me. I stopped for a moment, standing in the middle of the trail, looking around, but the woods were empty. Nothing was out of the ordinary. So I told myself I was being ridiculous. I've spent countless hours in these woods, and I knew them better than anyone. It was just my imagination. I decided to keep going, trying to push the unease aside, and the trail began to slope downwards as I neared the creek, and the air grew colder. And that's when I first started to hear it. It started as a low sound, something between a growl and a grunt, coming from the direction of the creek. I froze, instinctively pulling my body tight. It wasn't the sound of a bear or any other animal I recognized. It was different, and admittedly, it made my skin crawl. The sound was deep and rough, and it had an intensity that I just couldn't ignore. Again, I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a buck or a wild boar. I'd heard both of them in the woods before. But again, this was just different. And it was closer than I expected, too. I took a careful step forward, holding my breath, straining my ears. There was silence now, the kind that just happens before you realize that whatever it was you heard is no longer hiding, but is now in the open. I took another step, and then another, slowly creeping forward, my heart hammering in my chest. The creek wasn't far now, and I should have just turned around. I could have gone back to the safety of my house, but something inside of me, some primal instinct, told me to keep going, to push through whatever fear was trying to paralyze me. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another animal that was wandering through, or maybe even just a trick of light, making some animal look bigger than it really was. But as I stepped closer, I realized I wasn't looking at any of those things. This thing in front of me wasn't animal, but it wasn't human either. It looked like something in between. It was standing upright, and it was just a few yards away. It was in this small clearing in the creek. It was large, at least 7 feet tall, hell, maybe even more. Its body was covered in thick fur. It had this medium brown and this tan swirl in it, and a lot of the fur was matted. But its eyes were the worst part. They were glowing or illuminating this bright yellow, almost unnaturally, and they fixed directly on me. I swear, when it looked at me, I thought I released my bowels. I was terrified. I knew that this thing knew that I was there. This creature's head was wolf-like, but much larger than any wolf I'd ever seen. Its snout was elongated. There were sharp teeth visibly sticking out of its mouth at the sides, and then it let out another growl. It was low and intimidating, like it was warning me. Its ears were pointed, and they were alert and moving back and forth, so I knew this wasn't someone in a costume just trying to mess with me. Why would somebody be in a costume like that in the middle of the forest at night anyway? It's not like I had advertised I was going for a walk. These ears were moving, like it was listening to every sound that I made. I could see the fur on its back bristle, and its posture was tense. It was like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I didn't even know what to do. Everything in me was screaming, "Run, dumbass, run!" But my legs wouldn't obey my mind. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what it was that I was seeing, but nothing about this made any sense. There was no logical explanation for this monster standing before me. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't a wolf. It wasn't something else. Nothing that I could identify. It was something far more terrifying. And the only word I could actually think of was werewolf. I finally managed to force myself to take a step back, but my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled. When I did, this thing got excited, like it was ready to strike. Like it saw vulnerability, and it wanted to capitalize on it. I could hear the sound of its claws scraping against the dirt like it was preparing to pounce on me. And this thing made this excited grunting noise. I backed up again, my heart pounding, my pulse pounding in my ears, and I frigging stumbled again. I audibly cursed. I was so frustrated and scared. That monster's posture shifted as I stumbled backwards, and this time I almost fell. For a moment, I thought that it was going to charge. Its growling seemed to grow louder, and I could actually feel it in the pit of my stomach. I felt this overwhelming dread wash over me, like this thing was sucking every ounce of happiness right out of me. Like it was enjoying the fear that I was feeling, and maybe even feeding off of it, and heightening it so it could get some kind of, I don't know, emotional meal out of me. The night air was colder now, but it wasn't the kind of chill that you get from the weather that I was feeling. It was something else. Something far more primal, like a warning from nature. Warning you and your brain to get the hell out of there before it's too late. I took another step back, and this time I didn't trip. My mind was racing, and I could feel my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might actually burst out of my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Or should I stay still and hope it didn't attack? My instincts screamed to get the hell out of there, but my legs were like stone. I was paralyzed. I think I was actually paralyzed by fear, and in that moment, I knew I had to make a choice. That part of my brain was at least clear. That monster, the Dogman I guess you call it, seemed to sense my hesitation, like it was smart enough to realize I was trying to figure out what to do. It tilted its head and actually looked me up and down, like it was sizing me up or something. Almost like it was forming its own opinion about me, deciding whether I was a threat or prey. Then it stepped forward and I tried to scream, but I was so scared that nothing came out of my mouth. I don't know if anybody else has ever experienced that. Being so terrified that you try to scream, but something in your body won't let you. This thing moved smoothly and silently. I mean, for as big as this thing was, and we're talking large, like a predator of the night. It was so, I don't know, quiet. I mean, I could see every muscle bulging on this thing, but it was soundless when it wanted to be. I felt my breath catch in my throat again as this thing came even closer. Again, my brain was screaming at me to run, but I knew that if I turned around, if I showed this thing my back, it'd be all over. If I ran, this thing was damn sure going to chase me, and with those claws and teeth, I wouldn't last very long in a fight. The legs were so long I knew that the stride of it would easily catch me, and I had no idea of knowing how quickly this thing could actually move. I forced my legs into motion, backing up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, and my eyes never left that thing. That low growling never stopped either, but it also didn't seem to be getting any closer, almost like it was toying with me, like it was testing how far it could push me before I broke. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. It felt like forever. I tried to think, to plan my next move, but my mind was a blur. My phone was in my pocket, but I couldn't bring myself to take it out. The idea of looking away from that thing for even a second terrified me. And then this thing paused, and I swear it was reading my emotions. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt in that moment that this creature was just capable of that, of reading someone's emotions. It stood still for a moment. We stared at each other. I was ready to run and not look back, not caring if that thing attacked. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I was willing to risk it at that point. And then it did the most shocking thing. It crouched down, dropped to all fours. It looked over into the forest, and I swear I saw more eyeshine in that forest, but I got the distinct impression that the other creature that was in there was a lot smaller. And looking back on it, I honestly think that maybe it was this creature's young, and maybe the way that it was acting was just a way to intimidate me, to get me away from its baby. This thing went into the shadows, where I saw the other eyeshine. It turned its back on me, and I didn't hesitate. My legs finally obeyed. I turned and ran. As I was looking back, I saw this thing lope into the forest and disappear. And it might be my mind playing tricks on me, but I could have sworn I saw another, smaller shadow running next to it. I didn't care where it was going. I just needed to get away from that thing. My breath was coming in painful wheezes at this point, and my heart was hammering in my chest while I sprinted down that damn trail. I was trying my hardest not to trip on that uneven ground. I could hear these weird grunting noises coming from somewhere in the forest, or at least I think I did, but I didn't look back again. I was just focused on getting home. I pushed myself harder. My legs were burning with the effort. My mind was blank except for the desperate need to get away and get back to the house to see my girls. Then, just as I thought I couldn't run another step, I heard a loud crash, followed by something massive moving quickly through the woods, snapping branches and crashing into trees. It was like the creature was pursuing me again, but this time it was angrier and more determined. Maybe it was just making damn sure that I wasn't around its baby. I know that theory can't be proven, but that's just the feeling that I got. Call it a mother's instinct. Maybe these creatures feel the same thing, but I really think that that thing was threatened by me being down there and needed to get me away from its young. But anyway, that's when I started screaming. I still didn't look back though. My instincts told me it was closer than ever. I could feel it, like a presence behind me, right on my heels, but it wasn't a physical sensation of it being near me. I could just tell in my soul or something that it was behind me. I know all of that might make me sound like a crazy person, but again, it's just my intuition. That's when my heart seemed to stop in my chest and I could barely breathe. And then, suddenly, there I was. I was at the edge of the woods, the break where the trees gave way to the open field near my house. At that point, I ran even faster, not even knowing where this burst of stamina came from. It was probably just pure, terrified adrenaline. I pushed myself, through the last stretch of woods and stumbled out into the field. I didn't stop until I was standing in the open, under the streetlights near our property line. I turned to look back towards the woods, but there was no sign of that monster. The forest was still and quiet once again, like nothing had ever happened. I could hear my heart thundering in my ears, but the silence was so eerie that it made me shiver. I ran back to the house and stayed on the porch looking out at the forest. At that point, I knew that I was safe, but now my mother's intuition was kicking in again, and I needed to make sure that that thing wasn't following me to the house. I had my little girls there, and I needed to protect them just as much as that thing needed to protect its own baby. I could still feel my body trembling and shivering when I walked into the house. My mom was at the table now and looked up at me. When she saw my face, her own face went pale, and she knew that something was wrong. She got up and ran over to me, asking what was wrong. I tried to tell her, but suddenly I realized I was crying. I choked out what had happened, and she didn't say anything. I think she was trying to figure out if I was crazy or being honest. When my husband came home, I could finally breathe. I knew that he'd protect us. Apparently, my mom had either called him or texted him about my state, and he left work early to come home. As soon as he came through the door, I wrapped my arms around him, still crying. He asked what happened, and I explained what I saw. Some kind of monster. Not human. Nothing I have ever seen before, except in werewolf movies. I saw them both look at each other like I was out of my mind. My mom asked me if I was sure it couldn't have been some other animal since it was dark. I told them how it was on two legs and how the eyes were glowing. That didn't really help my case. I told them how close I was to it, that I couldn't misidentify something that was just feet away from me at one point. My husband said he'd go take a look, but I told him he wasn't leaving that house. Luckily, I guess I had freaked him out enough to where he didn't take much convincing. He stayed inside for the night. Since that night, we haven't had any run-ins with the Dogman. We moved, too. I just couldn't be by those woods anymore. It's a pretty traumatizing experience, to say the least. Every time I hear someone talk about the woods, that Dogman pops into my mind. I can't help but think of that night. I can't help but think of those glowing eyes and that deep, primal growl that still haunts my mind. And occasionally I still have nightmares about it. I don't think I'll ever forget it, or truly get over it, and I don't think I'll ever feel safe in the woods again. My name is James, but everyone calls me Jim. I'm 42 years old. I own a construction company, and I'm a lifelong, proud Texan. I run that company in Huntsville, a small town that most folks haven't heard of unless they've been through East Texas. I've been married for 18 years to my high school sweetheart. Her name's Karen. She's the one helping me type this up. That way it sounds professional. I could work a wrench and a hammer like nobody's business, but words aren't my strong suit. Anyways, we have two kids, Sophie, 14, and Jake, who just turned 10. My family is my world, and when I'm not at the shop, I'm helping the kids with schoolwork or spending time with them outdoors. I raised them both to hunt, fish, camp, you name it. I've always considered myself a practical man. My work demands it, and I have never been one for flights of fancy or tall tales. I like things I can see. I can touch, things I can fix with my hands. But what happened to me years ago made me question everything I thought I believed in. It was 2017, and it had been a hot, dry summer. It was unrelenting weather. So as summer turned into fall, I welcomed the cooler weather, and I was happy to be out in it. It was the kind of weather that makes you want to grab a thermos of coffee and sit in a deer blind for hours. And that's exactly what I was doing. We own a small patch of land, about 20 miles outside of Huntsville, deep in the piney woods. It's not much, maybe 15 acres, but it's mine. I'd built a small hunting cabin out there, little more than a shack, and I'd been going out every season since I bought the place. I'd taken the day off to get a head start on the weekend. Karen and the kids were fine with it. They knew how much I loved the peace and quiet of the woods. I left the house around 5 a.m. with my old Remington 700, a bag of gear, and my hunting dog Duke. Duke's a mutt, a mix of German Shepherd and Lab. But he's the smartest, most loyal dog I've ever had. The drive to the cabin takes about 45 minutes, but by the time I got there, the sun was just starting to wake up. I parked my truck, unloaded my gear, and set out for my favorite deer blind, which was about half a mile hike from the cabin. By the time I settled into the blind, the sun was just kissing the horizon. The sky was shades of orange and purple. Duke sat beside me, his ears perked up, his nose working the air. He was always alert, but he seemed more keyed up than usual. His hackles were raised slightly. I chalked it up to the scent of deer, or maybe even a fox in the area. The woods were quiet. Almost too quiet, if you know what I mean. Normally, you'd hear the call of birds and the chittering of critters that called the area home, even the occasional squirrel scurrying up a tree. But as I stood there, it was like the forest had the mute button pushed on it. Even the usual hum of the bugs was distinctly absent. I sat there for a long time, not seeing a single creature or even hearing signs of life out there. I decided to take a break and hike towards the little cabin I have. Halfway there, though, I started smelling this disgusting, rancid smell. I like to describe it as rotting meat in the sun. It was the worst thing that I've ever smelled. I got to my place, kicked back for a while, and dozed off. When I woke up, I decided to go back out to see if I could bag anything. The rest of the day passed, and I hadn't seen a single deer. Just as I was thinking about packing it in, Duke started growling, low and deep. His body was tense, and he was staring into the tree line out to our left. I followed his gaze, but I didn't see anything at first. I asked him what was wrong, patting him on the head and telling him to take it easy. And that's when I noticed it. There was movement in the underbrush. The sound of it was unmistakable. It wasn't the quick darting movement of a small animal. This was slower and more deliberate. At this point, the light was fading fast. I had napped a lot longer than I anticipated, but there was still enough to make out shapes in the shadows. I squinted, trying to focus on the source of the sound. And then what I saw, man, it still gives me nightmares to this day. At first, I just thought it was a large dog, maybe even a coyote or a wolf, though wolves aren't common in this part of Texas. But as it stepped out of the shadows, I realized this was something else completely. I mean, this thing was enormous. It easily would have been 6 or 7 feet tall if it stood upright. It was hunched over, moving on all fours, but its limbs were unusually long in the front, and its movements were different than a dog or a wolf. It didn't look like any canine that I actually knew. This thing moved stealthy too, almost like a leopard. It was quiet. The fur was dark, almost black, and it was matted in places, giving it this wild, unkempt appearance. It looked completely ferocious and wildly feral. I couldn't see its face clearly at first, but when it turned its head in my direction, my breath caught my throat. The light bounced off the eyes, making them look like they were illuminating or something. They were reflecting that amber hue that you see when an animal is caught in a car's headlights. Even the head was enormous. I want you to picture the biggest wolf that you've ever seen, whether in the wild or on TV or at a zoo. Get an appreciation for that. Now slope the back. Give it these weirdly long arms with human-like hands and a big bushy tail. And then double the size of that wolf. And that's exactly what I saw. But there was also this intelligence in its eyes that I can't really describe other than human. It had this almost human quality to it. And after talking with you and my wife, I want to describe this as a predatory awareness. Well, let me tell you, the intelligence that I saw even then sent a chill down my spine. Duke was growling louder now. His teeth were bared, but he didn't dare move. I could tell he was terrified, and honestly, so was I. I didn't know what the hell this thing could be. I gripped my rifle tightly, my mind racing. Just what the hell was I looking at? It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a big cat, it wasn't a wolf or a dog or a coy wolf. It wasn't anything that I'd ever seen before. I knew that I should stay still, to try to keep out of sight, and definitely not make any sudden movements, so I just froze. I'm not even sure I was breathing at that point. The dogman sniffed the air, its head turning in my direction. For a moment, I thought it might have caught my scent, but then it moved past the blind, heading deeper into the woods, and I let out a shaky breath, thinking it was over. But then this damn thing stopped. It froze mid-step and its head snapped around to look directly at me. It wasn't just looking in my direction. It was looking right at me. My heart felt like it stopped. This creature locked eyes with me, and I was hit with this overwhelming sense of dread and fear. Now, I was afraid before. Seeing this thing that I couldn't identify, I was at least nervous, but making eye contact with this thing, let me tell you, I've never felt that deep primal fear before. Its gaze was sharp and calculating, and even its look was almost human. Just the way that it was concentrating. I'd never felt so exposed. Like it could see straight through the camouflage blind and into my soul. Duke let out a sharp bark, breaking the silence and scaring the shit out of me. I quietly hushed him, but it was too late. This thing's ears twitched and it bared its teeth in a snarl that froze my blood. Its mouth was wide and lined with long, jagged teeth that looked more suited like a predator than anything I'd expect to find in these woods. Without thinking, I raised my rifle, aiming squarely at its chest. My hands were so shaky, I wasn't sure that I could hit it, but I figured the noise alone might scare it off. Before I could pull the trigger, though, the thing stood up. It went from 4 legs to just 2, and it happened so quickly, I almost didn't process it. We're talking 1 second, it's on all 4s, and the next, it's upright, towering over me. You asked me if I heard any popping noises, but I don't know. Honestly, I was so taken aback by what this creature was doing, I couldn't focus on anything else. When it was standing up like that, it must have been at least 7 feet tall. Hell, maybe even more. It could have been pushing 8. Its shoulders were broad. Its arms were unnaturally long and hanging at its sides, and they had these hands that ended in sharp, claw-like fingers. Again, you asked me if I could describe the claws, how long they were, and I would say that they were at least a couple inches long on every single finger. That's when I knew this wasn't just some animal. This thing resembled a werewolf more than anything else. I could feel my whole body shake, and my breaths were now tiny, pathetic little breaths. I was scared out of my gourd. Duke's growling turned into frantic barking, but he stayed by my side. He was brave, but I could tell he was just as terrified as I was. In our interview, you asked me what this creature did while it was standing there, what its movements were. Well, it didn't move. It didn't get any closer, but it tilted its head slightly, almost like it was studying us. I yelled at it to get back, my voice trembling, not coming out as loud or as intimidating as I was hoping it would. I wasn't sure if it could even understand me, but I had hoped the noise might scare it off. I know with a bear or a cougar, you want to be as big and threatening as possible. You want to be loud and look like you're not worth the fight. Well, does that apply to werewolves too? When I yelled, it didn't flinch though. Instead, it roared back at me, louder than anything that I've ever heard in my entire life. When I was younger, I used to work in an airport. I was on the runway a lot. Those planes were loud. But this thing, there was something about it that just seemed louder. I could feel the roar in my chest. I could feel it rattle my teeth. The sound wasn't just loud. It was resonant, and it was unnatural. It was the kind of noise that made every hair on my body stand on end. I was at a zoo here in Texas once too, and I heard the lions roaring. That was loud, and I appreciated how loud it was then, but that lion's roar was child's play compared to that dogman. That thing took a slow step forward after that, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I fired a shot, aiming at its chest. The crack of the rifle echoed through the trees, and for a brief moment, everything went still. It was like the entire forest was watching our showdown. The dogman staggered, letting out a noise that was half snarl and half roar, but still louder than anything I've ever imagined. It actually clutched its side where the bullet hit, and for a moment I thought that I had taken it down. I prayed that I had taken it down, but then it straightened up. I could see blood glistening against its dark fur. It wasn't dead, not even close. It let out a furious howl, a sound that was so primal and feral that it sent Duke running the opposite direction. All I had seemed to manage to do was piss this thing off, and now I thought I was done for. This thing was going to retaliate and tear my head off, and my loyal dog had already bolted with his tail between his legs, vanishing into the woods. So now, I was out here alone. I thought about calling after Duke, but I didn't want to take my eyes off of that creature. And then it actually charged me. I barely had time to react. It closed the distance between us in just a couple of seconds, moving with this speed and agility that I'd never seen before. It was supernatural, for lack of a better term. I scrambled backwards out of the blind, tumbling on my back and my ass, then over backwards into a somersault like I was a friggin' acrobat. Except, I'm not an acrobat. I'm about 60 pounds overweight. It would have been comical if I wasn't afraid for my actual life. And I dropped my rifle in the process too. My only thought was get to the truck. At that point, the forest seemed alive around me. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf amplified my panic. I could hear the creature behind me, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground as it gave chase. I don't know how I didn't trip or fall, but adrenaline is a hell of a thing. It was like my brain and my eyes were focused, and they were trained on anything that could delay my escape. I was yelling for Duke the whole time, hoping that he would bark or join up with me, but he was nowhere to be found. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw my truck, it felt like a miracle. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. My hands were so shaky that I fumbled the keys. I managed to finally start the engine, and I sped down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror. I didn't see anything. That thing wasn't chasing me anymore, but I knew that it was still out there, and I had to get out of that forest. I was more than happy to put as much distance between me and it as possible. And I didn't stop driving until I was back in Huntsville. I pulled into my driveway just as Karen was stepping outside to see what was wrong because I pulled in so fast. I must have looked like hell because she immediately asked if I was hurt. I knew that I was dirty, I was sweating, and all of that dirt probably clung to me. I told her that I'd seen a bear, that it charged at me and Duke, and that I'd barely gotten away. It wasn't entirely a lie, but I just couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. She would think that I lost my mind, and honestly, part of me wondered if I had, because the thing that I saw isn't supposed to exist. As for Duke, I know everybody's wondering about him. He showed up the next morning, dirty and shaken, but otherwise unharmed. He'd made it back, and it was a miracle. I felt like crap for leaving him behind, but I couldn't find him. I had yelled, trying to get him to come, but I think he was so far away from me that he might not have even heard me. He stayed glued to my side for days after that, like he knew that something terrible had happened. It's now been years since that night, and I haven't been back to the cabin one single time. I've thought about selling the land, but something about it feels wrong. Like, I would be responsible if anybody got hurt. I just can't justify selling that land to some poor son of a bitch that doesn't know what's out there. It just wouldn't be right. I don't even know if that thing is still out there or not, but I keep the land just in case. I don't want anybody getting hurt because of me. Since then, I've spent countless hours researching, trying to figure out what I saw. I know the closest thing that I've come to is a dogman, and that's probably what I saw. They're always described as an upright wolf-like creature, and there have been reports of them in Texas. Most people dismiss these stories as folklore, but I know better. I know it's not just some tall tale, and I know it's not just a creepypasta. I know these things are really out there because I saw one myself. I don't tell many people what happened that night, and the few that I have confided in either laugh it off or look at me like I'm crazy. And this is actually the first time I've actually gone public. I told Karen. She believes me. I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. Thanks for sharing my story. Jim.